There's a phase every empath goes through that feels almost like a curse. You walk into a room and instantly feel everything: tension, insecurity, hidden resentment, unspoken sadness, and none of it belongs to you. Yet somehow it becomes yours. You carry it, process it, and often try to fix it. For a long time, this feels like compassion. It feels like connection, but in reality, it's a lack of separation. It's the absence of a boundary between where you end and someone else begins. And this is where the transformation starts. A healed empath doesn't lose their sensitivity. That's the common misconception. They don't become cold, detached, or indifferent. What changes is far more precise and far more powerful. They develop what you could call emotional authority. Not control over others, but control over their relationship to what they feel. Before healing, empathy is reactive. It's automatic. Someone is anxious and your body mirrors it. Someone is angry and your nervous system absorbs it. You don't choose this. It happens instantly below conscious awareness. And because it feels so real, you assume it must be yours to deal with. So you step in, you soothe, you fix, you overextend. And slowly, without realizing it, you build a life where your internal state is dictated by external people. But healing interrupts that pattern. It introduces a small but critical gap between what you feel and what you do with it. And in that gap, something new emerges. Discernment. You begin to recognize that feeling something doesn't automatically mean you have to carry it. You can witness without absorbing. You can understand without internalizing. This is not detachment in the unhealthy sense. It's clarity. Think about the difference between standing in a storm and watching one through a window. Before healing, you're in the storm. Every emotional shift around you hits directly. After healing, the storm doesn't disappear. You just step out of it. You can still see it. You can still understand its intensity, but you're no longer being battered by it. And that changes everything, because once you stop absorbing, you stop reacting impulsively. You stop trying to manage other people's emotions as a way to regulate your own. You start asking better questions. Is this mine? Becomes a filter. Am I responsible for this? Becomes a boundary. And most importantly, what is the appropriate response here? Replaces the old instinct of immediate emotional labor. This is where empathy evolves from a burden into a skill. A healed empath can walk into that same room, feel the same tension, and not be controlled by it. They can read the emotional landscape with accuracy, but instead of merging with it, they analyze it. They choose how to engage, if at all. And that choice is where their power lies. Because when you're no longer overwhelmed, you become strategic. You start to notice patterns you couldn't see before. You recognize when someone is projecting, when someone is seeking validation, when someone is testing boundaries, and instead of reacting emotionally, you respond intentionally. Sometimes that response is compassion. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's distance. But it's always chosen, not triggered. This shift also changes how people experience you. Before, others might have been drawn to your openness, but they also sensed your availability or willingness to take on more than you should. And whether consciously or unconsciously, people tend to lean into that. After healing, that dynamic changes. You're still empathetic, but there's a structure to it. There's a presence that says, I understand you, but I'm not here to carry you. And that creates respect, not because you demand it loudly, but because your energy communicates it clearly. There's a steadiness to you, a groundedness. You're no longer easily pulled into emotional chaos, and that makes you both more effective and more selective in how you engage. It's important to understand that this doesn't happen overnight. For many empaths, this shift feels uncomfortable at first. There's guilt. There's a sense of I should be doing more. That's because your identity has been built around being the one who absorbs, who fixes, who gives endlessly. Letting go of that role can feel like losing a part of yourself. But what you're actually losing is the part that was unsustainable. What replaces it is something far more stable. You begin to realize that true empathy isn't about self-sacrifice. It's about accurate understanding combined with appropriate action. And sometimes the most appropriate action is to do nothing, to allow others to experience their own emotions without interference. This is where emotional authority fully takes hold. You're no longer at the mercy of every emotional signal around you. You become the filter, the interpreter, the decision maker. Your empathy becomes intentional rather than automatic. And because of that, it becomes far more impactful. When you do choose to engage, it's focused. It's measured. It's effective. You're not drained at the end of the day. You're not overwhelmed by interactions. You're not carrying conversations in your mind long after they've ended. You move through environments with awareness, but also with protection. Not walls, just clarity about what belongs to you and what doesn't. And once you reach this point, something subtle but profound happens. You stop fearing your own sensitivity. You stop seeing it as something that makes you vulnerable. Instead, you recognize it as a form of intelligence, one that when disciplined gives you insight most people never develop. You don't shut off your empathy. You refine it. And that refinement is what turns it from something that once controlled you into something that now works for you. Because the moment you realize you can feel everything without carrying anything is the moment you stop being overwhelmed by the world and start understanding it. There's a moment in an empath's life where they begin to realize that what they once called kindness was in many cases a lack of boundaries. Not intentional, not malicious, just unexamined. They gave because it felt right. They tolerated because they understood. They stayed because they could see the pain behind someone's behavior. And for a long time, that felt like strength. But over time, the pattern reveals its cost. When you operate without clear boundaries, your identity becomes shaped by other people's expectations. You start anticipating needs that were never expressed. You start saying yes before you've even checked in with yourself. And perhaps most importantly, you start believing that your value is tied to how much you can endure, how much you can give, and how much you can fix. Healing disrupts that belief system at its core. A healed empath comes to a very uncomfortable realization. Love without boundaries is not noble blitz self-erasure. It creates relationships where one person is consistently overextended and the other becomes often unintentionally dependent on that overextension. And the longer that dynamic continues, the harder it becomes to break because it starts to feel like identity. This is just who I am. But it isn't who you are. It's what you've practiced. And what's been practiced can be changed. The shift begins when the empath starts to redefine responsibility. Before healing, there's an unspoken rule. If I can help, I should help. After healing, that rule becomes more precise. If it is mine to carry, I will carry it. If it is not, I will let it remain where it belongs. That distinction is subtle, but it's transformative. Because once you understand that not everything requires your involvement, you begin to reclaim your time, your energy, and your emotional stability. Boundaries in this context are not barriers. They're filters. They determine what enters your space and what doesn't. They define what you will engage with and what you will step away from. And most importantly, they remove the assumption that access to you is unlimited. This is where many empaths struggle initially because they've been conditioned to associate boundaries with rejection. Saying no feels like hurting someone. Pulling back feels like abandonment. But that's because the frame has been distorted. Boundaries are not an act of aggression. They're an act of clarity. They communicate something very simple. This is where I end and this is where you begin. A healed empath learns to express this without apology. Not with hostility, not with defensiveness, but with calm certainty. There's no need to overexplain, no need to justify every decision. The boundary stands on its own because it's rooted in self-respect rather than fear. And this is where the real power emerges. When your no becomes clear and consistent, people begin to adjust. Some will respect it immediately. Others may test it, especially if they've benefited from your lack of boundaries in the past. That testing is not a sign that your boundary is wrong. It's a sign that it's new. And consistency is what solidifies it. Over time, something interesting happens. The relationships that relied on your overextension begin to fade or transform. The ones that remain are built on mutual respect, not silent obligation. You're no longer the person who absorbs everything and asks for nothing. You become someone who engages intentionally, who gives without depletion, and who receives without guilt. This also changes your internal landscape. Before there was a constant low-level tension, a sense that you were always slightly behind, always slightly overwhelmed, always carrying more than you should. After boundaries are established, that tension begins to dissolve. There's space where there used to be pressure. There's clarity where there used to be confusion. You start to notice how much of your previous stress wasn't coming from life itself, but from you. Inability to say no to what wasn't aligned with you. And once you see that, it becomes very difficult to go back because boundaries don't just protect your energy, they refine your life. They force you to prioritize. They force you to decide what actually matters and what doesn't. And in doing so, they eliminate a significant amount of noise. You're no longer reacting to everything. You're choosing what deserves your attention. This doesn't make you less compassionate. It makes your compassion more effective. Instead of spreading yourself thin across every situation, you're able to focus your energy where it can actually make a difference. You're no longer helping out of obligation or guilt. You're helping out of alignment. And that difference is felt both by you and by others. There's also a philosophical shift that occurs here. You begin to understand that every person is responsible for their own emotional experience. You can support, you can guide, you can listen, but you cannot live someone else's life for them, and trying to do so doesn't help them. It prevents them from developing their own capacity to handle challenges. So in a paradoxical way, your boundaries don't just protect you, they also serve others. They create an environment where accountability can exist, where people are encouraged to step into their own responsibility rather than relying on you to carry it for them. And that's a far more sustainable form of connection. A healed empath doesn't withdraw from the world. They simply stop over-participating in it. They recognize that their energy is finite and they treat it accordingly. They give, but not endlessly. They listen, but not at the cost of themselves. They engage, but only where it's appropriate. And perhaps most importantly, they no longer feel the need to be everything for everyone because they understand something that changes everything. Your capacity to care does not obligate you to sacrifice yourself. There's a subtle but profound shift that happens once an empath has moved through the earlier stages of healing. After learning to separate what they feel from what they carry, they begin to understand the true nature of their situation. And after establishing boundaries that protect their time and energy, something else begins to sharpen, something quieter, but far more precise. Their perception changes. Before healing, an empath often sees the best in people. Not because they're naive, but because they're attuned to potential. They can sense the underlying pain, the unspoken wounds, the version of someone that exists beneath their behavior. And because of that, they tend to interpret actions through a lens of compassion. Red flags are noticed, but then explained away. Inconsistencies are felt, but then rationalized. The story becomes more important than the evidence. And this is where many empaths lose themselves. Because when you prioritize potential over pattern, you end up investing in who someone could be rather than who they consistently show themselves to be. You become patient where you should be cautious. You become understanding where you should